Welcome to the Fly Culture Podcast, bringing you interviews, reviews and fishing tips. Here's your host, Pete Tigers.
Hi everyone, welcome back to this week's Fly Culture Podcast. My guest today has some impressive fishing credentials. He's a guide, a master casting instructor, has written 3 books, has presented a TV programme called Wild Fish, which I was a great big fan of, is a hugely talented photographer, has written many magazine articles, including a piece for Fly Culture magazine too on Mongolia. It's my great pleasure to introduce Peter Morse to the Fly Culture Podcast. Peter, it's great to have you along. Thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me today. How are you doing?
Very well, thanks, mate. Very well. In the middle of this, hopefully at the end of this lockdown we've had for a few months now, but looking forward to spring and summer and going fishing. Yeah.
Fantastic. And for our listeners, Peter's based down in Australia, and things obviously for you, and I know we were talking off mic from a fishing perspective, have been a little bit problematic to say the least, haven't they?
Yeah, travel has been very restricted. We've had I live on the outer fringes of the Greater Sydney metropolitan area, and we're the outermost postal zone, and we've been restricted basically to our local government area for the last 3 months. I live on top of the mountains, the Blue Mountains, an hour and a half west of Sydney, and this is a narrow sandstone plateau that is basically bedrock. It's scoured by bushfires and washed by floods and so on, so there's not a lot of nutrients in the soil or the rivers. And the rivers are very short. They tumble off escarpments into valleys, waterfalls. I have some mates who fish these tiny little creeks up here, but they're terribly overgrown, and I'm a little beyond that these days. So we're just coming out of winter, and it's been terribly restrictive. I was due to leave for a 3-month road trip up the Queensland coast, which I do most years. I drive all the way to Townsville. I have a son and grandkids in Townsville, and I teach fly casting all the way up the coast. I stop at all these coastal towns, and I do a Saturday here and then a Sunday there with anywhere between 6 and 10 people, and teaching fly casting, and work my way up to Townsville, fishing and teaching. And of course I work Saturday, Sunday teaching, and then I fish and travel Monday to Friday. But not this year. So, I had to cancel that, unfortunately, tragically. And so I've been confined to quarters, so to speak. But anyway, spring is here. The restrictions have been...
That's been a long layoff for you, hasn't it? Comparable, I know we had similar here, but not quite as long. It's since you've had a fly rod in your hand in anger, that's been quite some time, hasn't it?
3 months. This is the longest I have been at home for 35 years.
I hope your loops are looking really sweet as a result of that. I found during our lockdown that all of the time I was getting rods out, I was practicing casting, I was playing with different fly lines and looking at different combinations. Have you found you've been doing a fair bit of that as well?
I've been doing a lot of spey casting, two-handed stuff down at the local lake. I'm working towards my two-handed instructor certification. It's a small lake, and in winter we have westerly winds, so that's all right hand up. And in summer we have all easterly winds, so that's all left hand up. So my right arm is worked to death. And it's also during the lockdown became a very popular walking and outdoor spot. So I was actually part of the local entertainment, a source of entertainment to people. Oh, what are you catching, mate? Yeah, and so anyway, that kept me occupied. But I have tied hundreds and hundreds of flies in preparation for this summer. In fact, just today I've started throwing out, making space. I think I threw out about 1,000 flies today. From this big to this big, just rusty stuff and stuff that's been used and stuff that's become messy, and so anyway, but I've been tying at the other end, and I've got to make space. So that's occupied most of my.
Great. And it's interesting that you mentioned about doing the courses up on your way to see your family and getting people casting and interested in casting. And I find that fascinating, that I guess because of who you are and how well you're known in the certainly in the world of fly fishing, but certainly in Australia as well, that I guess you have no problems filling out those spaces. But to get a sense of the fly fishing community, is it hardcore? Is it a large group of people? Does it tend to be a little bit smaller? How would you best describe it?
Extremely diverse would be the first thing I would say. There is certainly a very hardcore element, that real dedicated bunch of fly fishermen or fly fishers these days who are devoted to the sport. All around the country, there are these small towns, usually separated by a few hundred kilometres, and in some cases 500 kilometres, and within these coastal towns, there are a number of fly fishermen, some more so than others, and they form their own little community, and they are doing stuff in those towns that we often don't get to hear about, and they're catching fish, and they're evolving fly fishing within their own niche. And every now and then we get to hear about it. It's very exciting, although they do tend to fly under the radar a fair bit. So you must understand that it's probably, we only discovered flats fishing in the 1990s. And before that, flats were just a navigational hazard. And so boats went around them, and then there's a story behind the discovery of the first flats fishery we had. But that got people looking, and I guess programs like Wild Fish and a lot of the series out of the US and flats fishing and Lefty Cray's books and Lefty Cray's visit to Australia started to open our eyes up. And there's a whole generation of young blokes now in their 30s and 40s, a lot of them, who have just embraced this so enthusiastically and have really pushed flats fly fishing and the exploration of our shallow waters along at a great pace. And there's a lot of exciting stuff happening around the country. And in the last few years, we discover new fish. There's a species of fish here we know as a blue bastard. That was a sweet lip and was thought to be a not a deep water species, but a fish that dwelt in 30 to 40 to 50 feet of water. And an observant fly fisherman said, who had a science degree in not marine biology, but marine science, said, hang on, these aren't the same. These fish aren't the same as those fish. We're calling these those fish. These are something else. And he sent a couple of samples off to one of the museums, and it's a completely new species. And, that's happened in the last 5 or 6 years. So as we look at and explore these flats, we find new species, we find new fisheries. And, of course, if you go north of Cairns to the top of Cape York and around the whole Gulf of Carpentaria, there's thousands of kilometres of coastline with no people on. There's just no people there. So there's a world of fly fishing up there waiting to be explored. Then, of course, there's all the Great Barrier Reef system where there aren't green zones that's so lightly touched and so lightly fished on the flats. The deeper stuff gets fished commercially and fished recreationally, but the actual reef flats it's just virgin water in many cases. So there are these, to go back to your question, there are these little communities of fishermen, of fly fishermen, growing up and developing all around the country. And, of course, they've got access to the latest tackle and access to the latest flies and what have you through the internet. And some of them try and teach themselves how to cast. But a lot of them do want to they are so open to instruction, to learning proper methods, and how to deal with the wind is a big thing in this. How to cast heavy flies, how to retrieve all the different retrieves that you can use, etc., etc., etc. So they're just like big sponges. They just soak up this information. And as you say, I'm pretty well known, and I don't have a lot of problem booking out these trips. In fact, I restrict I do full days, sort of 8 in the morning until 4 in the afternoon, and I restrict my numbers to about 8 people so that I can answer so many questions, and I can sit down and have a chat to them, and we can do a session on knots and flies. I pull out my fly boxes and so on. So it's a pretty interesting day, and they absolutely love that because they're not really exposed to it. They're working within their own bubble a lot of the time. So it's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun.
And I guess a lot of that with the coastline and people wanting to fish coastlines, you're teaching them, like you say, to throw heavy stuff, to throw further. I guess must be interesting teaching self-taught casters to double haul. That must be kind of an interesting challenge.
You know, the basic level of casting among the saltwater guys is very high. You know, I'll get beginners and I'll get people who struggle with it, but I'm usually coming in with guys who, most of them are young. Most of them are young, so they learn a lot quicker than us old farts, you know, and they pick it up quickly. And I have ways of, I've taught so much over the years, I have ways of teaching the double haul that most people get it within a minute, the way I teach it. So even if they don't have great coordination, I'll leave them. If they've come as a beginner, and by the end of the day they're throwing okay loops, the last thing I'll do is teach them how to double haul so that they go away with it. They go away with that idea at the end of the day. They'll be hauling. It might not be perfect. It might not be, well, it's usually a long way from perfect. But I call it planting seeds. You know, I plant those seeds for them. And they go away. And next year I go up there and see them, they're throwing 80 feet, you know. Of course, we're using heavier rods, 8, 9, 10 weights most of the time. And I think that makes it a little bit easier. You know, having that mass in the line, you can feel the rod working. And dealing with wind is one of the big issues. You know, teaching people how to deal with the wind, all the various casts that can take up half a day. In fact, I do whole classes on dealing with the wind. But on the whole, the standard of casting around the coast is pretty high. I'm always impressed.
And you said interestingly about the younger people and their ability to cast. And I've asked this question before, and I wondered, I'd love to know what your thoughts are about it, in that, do you think the likes of YouTube and the sort of those sorts of things, whereas before we had to buy a book like Lefty's book or whoever it may be, Ed's book, or Jason's, and before we had to do that, but now you can go onto YouTube. And I'd noticed latterly that people were picking up casting a whole lot quicker because they had that ability to learn to cast by watching as well and taking that on board. Do you think there's an element of modern technology has played a part in that as well?
Very much so. A huge part. Yeah. I do warn them to be selective about what they're watching. You know, there's a lot of rubbish on YouTube, and I do warn them. I work very much with the fundamentals of good casting, and I teach them you've got to read the shape of the fly leg of the loop to know what you're doing. I mean, as instructors, that's what we read, and I tell them that's what you should be reading. You're going to be stuck here for 12 months teaching yourself or working with a friend. Read the fly leg of the loop. That'll tell you about how well you're casting. And when you look at someone on YouTube, have a look at the fly leg of their loop. And that'll tell you if they know what they're talking about or not. You know, is it straight? Is he throwing tails? Is he throwing a dome loop? Read the loop. Become a student. Become observant. Become critical. Not too critical. And so I leave them with that thought. But yes, it has accelerated learning. It has accelerated learning dramatically. Even to the point now where the old DVDs and videos, you rarely see them anymore. So much of it is on YouTube. But then so much of it isn't. As I go down this two-handed THCI journey, I'm searching for stuff on YouTube that I need to understand, and I can't find it. There's a lot of stuff I can't find. So there's still a lot of room there for other clips on YouTube. But certainly the learning process has shortened dramatically. I remember when I learned how to fly cast, and there's a story there in itself. It was a long process because there was no one around to teach. And I finally got someone to have a look at my cast, an old chap from the local fly fishing club, and I could cast better than him at that stage. So, he said, "Oh, you cast better than me. I'll leave you to it." So, it's the curve is drastically shortened. Yeah,
and that's a really interesting point. And do you think that I like the tip about watching the line as well, which is a great one. And, I always just say to people, if something's gone wrong, don't say that was just a bad cast. Think about what caused that. And I think that helps people improve. But with this lockdown, we've had, I guess, where you have so much more open land, generally speaking, to fish and a big coastline, we've had over here a growth in the amount of anglers coming as a result, I guess, of lockdown, people wanting to move out into the country and everything else that goes with that, and embracing what may be considered country sports. Do you think, or have you seen signs of that over there, or you haven't? I don't know. I wondered if it was happening over there too.
Very much so. Those towns within a 3 hours or 4 hour drive of Sydney are absolutely booming. Real estate has gone through the roof in those rural towns. Yeah, a lot of people moving to country areas, places where the median house price has doubled in the last 2 years since the COVID thing happened. People just want to get out, and they've discovered they can do a lot of work from home, and those regional towns are beautiful places. Some of them are on rivers, some aren't, but certainly the country sports, the hunting, fishing, and wine country is very, very popular. A lot of wine country around Sydney. And, it's exactly the same thing here.
Cool. And it's good that our community and our fly fishing family continues to grow. So it's good to see this as well. I wanted to take you touched briefly on where you started. Where was it that the fly rod, I guess you probably grew up with a rod in your hand, but where was it that the fly rod really entered your life? And did you realise this is where I want to be? I want to spend a large portion, if not all, of your life casting a fly rod from there. Do you know when that sort of moment happened for you?
Yes, absolutely. I remember it very clearly. So my grandfather and my father were both fly fishermen, and my grandfather ran hatcheries and stocked most of those rivers I was talking about earlier that are within an hour to 2 hours of where I live. He had a hatchery and that was run by the Central Acclimatisation Society, and he managed that. He actually, I think I mentioned in my bio, he actually provided the fish that was stocked into the New Guinea highlands, rainbow trout, many in the 1950s. And Dad was a fly fisherman, but he worked in Fiji. He was transferred there to work, and he built boats for the family as a hobby, and we fished every weekend, trolling heavy hand lines. And he died over there, and then we moved back to Australia, and my grandmother handed me a split cane fly rod, a Hardy Perfect reel, a 3 5/8 inch Hardy Perfect reel, which I still have, but I slipped on a rock and broke the frame. The cane rod, it was a Hardy Palacona cane rod, was stuffed. It had been badly stored. And then another bag was a Cashmore side-by-side shotgun. And I sold the Cashmore, which I regret to this day, but I bought a Volkswagen and a surfboard, and I went surfing. But I had this cane rod. The cane rod was still functional at that stage. And I strung it up, and on the reel was an old silk line that had been untreated for many, many years. And it was like those those slinky things those springs that you could get walking down the stairs. It was like a concertina, this thing. And I had no idea what I was doing. Of course, this is 1973. And there was no one in Sydney at the time that we knew. We'd just freshly come from Fiji to Sydney. And there were old family friends there and so on. But so I used to walk down to the local park in the afternoon with this cane rod and flail away. And eventually, of course, the bindings gave way and the thing split. So, but the bug had bitten at that stage. And there was a shop in the city run by a Frenchman. And I went in, and his family, his wife and son worked there. And I went in and visited this shop, and I bought a Hardy Jet fiberglass rod, a DAM reel, and a Scientific Angler ASL Supreme. And that was, 1973, and I just sort of never looked back. It was something I knew at that moment that I just wanted to do this. I don't know about wanting to do it for a living. At that stage, I was just starting out in the wine business. I actually went on to become a wine judge, but that was a long time ago, and I realised that being drunk for a living didn't have a lot of future. But I worked for one of the great wine men of the world, a fellow called Len Evans. Len Evans, who was a respected worldwide, and I worked for him and trained under him. But then in 1979, I moved to the mountains to be closer to the fishing, and I was offered a job at one of the top restaurants as a sommelier, and I settled in there for a few years and would fish because it was a weekend retreat. We'd sort of work Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and I'd fish all the other days. So I got to know the local streams pretty well. At about this time, I became, go back a few years, I became really interested in casting. I knew that to be a successful fly fisherman, I learnt pretty early on that I had to become a much better caster. And I had an old friend from Fiji, and her husband, or her partner, was a very keen fly fisherman, a fellow called Gordon Dunlop, and a wonderful, wonderful caster, a real student of lefties. He had Lefty's early casting book, and the pages were curled and thumbed and greasy from being turned, and everything was noted and notes written in all the columns, and Gordon was a wonderful caster. And so I started casting with him a lot and learned pretty early on, but still there were, I learned very early on what a good loop was. And Gordon was mostly a saltwater guy. And I remember I caught my first saltwater fish with him. That was 1977. And I remember the first time I went out with Gordon on his boat, and he showed me what a cast really was. He had a shooting head rigged on a rode-on ball-cast rod, and he threw this thing so far I could not believe my eyes, and that's what I want to do. And so we've been great mates ever since. I can outcast him these days, but he won't hear that. From then on, that's all I wanted to do. Now, creative writing was something I was good at, and I'd started writing for a couple of wine magazines back then, and then I submitted a couple of stories to fishing magazines, and the first couple were, of course, rejected, and there were insufficient photos, so I bought a camera. And I learned how to take photographs. I studied photography. I did a couple of courses on photography. I did some writing courses, and then I never sort of really looked back on, from there. I gave up on the wine thing, and in 1989 I moved back to Fiji for a couple of years to run a charter boat, a marlin fishing boat, and then came back to Australia in 1991. Absolutely broke, lost everything I had, and worked in New Guinea for a couple of seasons on the black bass up there, and then had a real stroke of luck when, in the late 1980s, when Lefty came down to Australia, there was a production company that filmed Lefty's trip, and I did a little bit of filming. I was invited along as a fly fisherman on those trips, and the cameraman was John Hankey, a fellow called John Hankey, and his partner in the business was Rod Harrison, a very famous fisherman in this part of the world. And Rod had been communicating with Lefty for a long time and brought Lefty down to Australia, and they made this couple of fishing programs on Lefty Down Under. But I'd done a little bit of filming with John, and then in 1992, 93, I think, I got a call from John saying I've been asked to shoot a promotional program on the New England district in northern New South Wales. Would you like to come and present it? I've done that kind of stuff before, but the one thing I did enjoy very much at school was theatre. I went to a boarding school, and I enjoyed theatre a great deal. And I was always very comfortable in front of a camera. I'm just talking to a camera, you know. Anyway, John could obviously see John was a very experienced cameraman, and I went and presented this travel doco on the New England district for the local tourism authority. And while we were on the road, we had a conversation about making it. John had been dying to make a TV series for years. And I said, well, as a matter of fact, I know someone in one of the major TV channels who's a very good friend of my partner's, Monique, very good old friend of Monique's. So we went in and had a meeting with him, and he said, yeah, we'll take it. We did a pitch, and he said, yeah, we'll take it. We'll give you 13 episodes, 13.5-hour episodes. And I ended up putting them on primetime television, 8 o'clock on a Tuesday night, which was unbelievable, just unbelievable, you know. And this predates cable or anything. I mean, there were only 5 channels in Australia then. And it was ended up going around the world, I think, to 36 countries. And then we did another 13. And then it wound up after that. We'd sort of I've made a couple of pilots for a couple of episodes, but they didn't go anywhere, and the time had passed for that had passed. So that's sort of the background on it. So I came into that as a fly fisherman. Ever since that day in 1973, I've been a fly fisherman, and any fishing I did in the wild fish program with plug and spin rod was to keep some sponsors happy. I wanted to fly fish, you know, and I learned to become a pretty dab hand with a plug rod and a spin rod, but everything I've ever done since then, and since those couple of years of game fishing, 89 to 1991, has all been about fly fishing. Everything. I own some I own a spin rod that I use as a teaser rod when I'm fishing in the salt water, and no lure that has ever been on that has had a hook on it, so it's never caught a fish. It's a sage spin rod. And I own a couple of teaser rods for teasing billfish, because I do love fly fishing for marlin and sailfish, so I've got a couple of teaser rods that have overhead reels on them, and that's it. All of my marlin lures, none of them have hooks on them. None of the lures I have are all teasers. None of them have hooks on them. The only thing you'll find in my gear with hooks is flies. So that's that took me through. The Wildfish series ended in the late 1900s, so 1990s. So.
Lovely. I love that program. I know we were talking off mic, and I was a big fan. Getting fly fishing on TV is always great news as far as I'm concerned, and then getting the chance to see the different sort of fishing in different countries as well was hugely enjoyable. And I used to sit down with my daughter and watch those programs and enjoy those immensely. So thank you for those. And I think you're being incredibly modest about your photography as well, which I think is absolutely fantastic. And I've talked about this before on previous podcasts, and fly fishing is such a photogenic pastime, isn't it? With the species, the casting, the settings, everything else. It's a win-win, isn't it, for a photographer?
Absolutely. The hard part, of course, is putting the rod down. And these days I tend to, as you would well know, I tend to keep the rod in hand a lot more. I mean, I'm 67 now. I don't do a lot of writing these days. I'm still very keen on photography. I'm pretty keen on shooting my own movies at the moment, but I'm still very keen on stills photography. And I have been on some trips where I haven't pulled out a camera. And I've been on others where the conditions have been fantastic, when I've been with really good fishermen and we've caught plenty and they know how to hold a fish, and where I've just sat back and shot pics. But if you want to get really good pics, you've just got to be prepared to put the rod down. I have managed to, for the last 20 years, I've always fished with a camera around my neck. I haven't drowned it. No, I did one. I tried in some quicksand in New Zealand. I went through the crust of this sandbar, whoompa, over my waders, and I had a camera around my neck that got drowned. But apart from that, I always keep that camera around my neck so it's there ready to go. And it's got a lens on for the occasion, and it's set ready to fire, and you've just got to be prepared to pull it out and do it, to drop what you're doing and pull it out and do it. I'm sure your listeners have heard that tip plenty of times. If you want to take good pics, you just have to be prepared to put the rod down.
Yeah, good advice. Good advice. We've touched on it a little bit with the tuition and everything else. Was then becoming a casting instructor a natural progression for you? And also, did you learn much yourself from that process as well?
A huge amount. So I had taught fly casting in my own way up until I got my CI. I thought I knew a bit about casting. I've done plenty of fly fishing. I know what I'm talking about. And I have no doubt I helped a few people. But then when I got onto the casting instructor bandwagon, roller coaster, things changed dramatically. So I did my CI and passed first time round. I truly don't know how, but I got through. Then I had been convinced that I could do my MCI the following day. I'd been talked into it. Go on, have a go. God, I think back how stupid how idiotic that was. I mean, I was so far from it took me 2 years of casting 4 hours a day to get past my MCI. And my examiners were Lass Carlson and Chuck Easterling. And Chuck Easterling was the deputy public prosecutor for the state of Arkansas. and Lass is this deadpan Dane, one of the great casters of the world, and they were my examiners, and I can tell you we didn't get very far. Well, I didn't get very far. They knew I was what we call these days a donor. I'd paid my fee to do the test and, help fly them down there, but I was nowhere near ready. But a real spark was lit at that. I'm going to get this. I'm going to do this. And I set out to get my MCI, and I worked for 2 years. I did have, to my great advantage, I did have a lot of fishing experience. Okay, and so dealing with the wind, throwing curved casts, throwing mends, all of that stuff came naturally to me. I just had to hone it one-handed with no hauling. I just had to perfect it to get that fly leg, gun barrel straight and good loop shapes and loop sizes and so on, and to be able to explain it and teach it. And it was a wonderful thing. I think they're a great organisation. I think it's a wonderful program. I would encourage anyone who is enthusiastic about becoming A, a better caster, and B, an instructor, and C, a better fisherman, to take it up, to have a crack. Look, it's tough. I remember early on after I got my MCI, I tested a fella who was a doctor in emergency hospital doctor, triage and so on. And he passed his CI that day, and he said the CI test for him was tougher than any medical exam he'd done. For some reason, it's seen as it's not a difficult test if you put in the time. It's not like someone's life is at stake, but your personal ego, you're stepping up in front of your peers. That's when you're really laying it out there. And so for me and the THCI is a similar journey. Unfortunately, I don't have running water here. I only have lakes, so that makes it even more challenging in my view. But that's another. Yeah. We don't have any two-handed fishing here, really. I mean, we off the beaches and the rocks, and there are some medium-sized river where I fish trout spay. I love my trout spay gear, my 2, 3, and 4 weight in 11 to 12 footers. I love fishing them, and of course New Zealand has some wonderful big rivers, so I get to fish the two-handers over there. But apart from that, it's not like the single-hand stuff where you were just chasing. I was chasing so many fish for so many years that you honed your casting. And this other stuff, it's just practice. And I also do have a little bit of an axe to grind with the FFI, or IFF as it is these days, International Federation of Fly Fishers, IFFF, in that I see myself as I'm an MCI, but I see myself as very much on the fishing side of the MCI ledger, as opposed to the pure casting side of the ledger. When I did my MCI test, my examiners were very interested in talking fishing rather than the pure technicalities of casting, which was my, I'll admit that I'm no physicist, for God's sake. I'm no engineer. I'm part of what Mel Krieger called the poets. But I'm a fisherman. I can throw flies in howling winds better than, I reckon, 99% of the people on the planet, and big flies a long way and so on, and deal with presentations and circumstances purely out of experience and instinct rather than something I learned in the park. And so I consider myself very much on the, if we take a middle line here, we've got our pure casters over here and our pure fishermen over here. Well, I'm very much on this side of the ledger. How to apply these casts to certain fishing circumstances, and how to deal with difficult fishing circumstances, difficult presentations based on the casting. But what underpins it all is the fact that I've done it. It's not something theoretical practiced in the park or something. I've done it, and I've done it for years. So I guess that's how I view it. And there is, in my view, a bit too much of a swing away from the fishing aspect of the casting instructor certification program. I would really like to see an emphasis remain on that rather than, the physics and the engineering side of it. But that's my weakness, so, I would say that, wouldn't I?
I'm with you on that, and I'm over on that side of it as well. So, and I think I'm a poet as well, in the sense that, the engineering aspects of it and the physics of it are way above my head. And I do it because I want people, I know if you're teaching people, you've got to have a good understanding, but I want them to love fishing like I do. I don't want it to be like an exam for the person who's just learning to fly cast. I want it to be fun, and I want them to take it up and love it like me. But I wanted to move on a little bit while we're talking down that route before we get back onto fishing. And I know you've had a really long association with Sage and Rio, and I wanted to know, how did that start? Is it fun playing with prototypes? And are you seeing these, the big changes that we're seeing in resins, the lightness of rods, the change in actions a little bit, that they're a little bit deeper bending, those super stiff rods? Do you think we've gone as far in the short term as we possibly can? I'm sorry, that's a multi-layered question, but I wanted to get your thoughts on all of those sort of the aspects of it, really.
Yeah, sure. So my relationship with Sage goes back to when Lefty came down here. So in those days, Lefty was an ambassador for Sage, and I met him and we cast, and we spent some time with him when he was in Sydney, and he wrote a lovely letter to Sage saying, Peter Morse, young fellow in Australia, you should, put him on the books, keep an eye on him. And then the Wildfish series came along after that. So I opened that avenue through the JM Gillies, who are the importers for Sage in Australia, and they jumped right on board. Once we'd signed up the TV series, they jumped right on board. And it had a huge impact on Sage sales in this part of the world, huge. And I've been with them ever since. That Lefty's visit down here was 1988, 87, 88. So, but the filming started in 94, I think, 1994. So I've been very much involved with them ever since. Many early years, nothing to do with R&D or trialling rods. Much more so in the recent years. I spent a bit of time with Jerry Seam, wonderful man, and stayed with him in Montana and fished with him. And Jerry's moved on now. He's living the life in the hills of Montana and Florida. And young Peter Knox is designing rods for Sage now. And I will say I have certainly noticed a change in philosophy in the rods. The blazingly fast rods are still there in the Igniter series and the X, but I can see them. I think they'll still have their super fast rods, but I can see the what do they call? They're still the premium rods, but those, the LL and its predecessors are coming more and more to the forefront. Peter did send me a trial model of what may be the new rod in time in an 8-weight, and I took that to Western Australia earlier this year and broke it on a fish. It was a beautiful rod. Dumbass. Anyway, look, that's what you get. It's what you get sent these rods for. Put them through their paces. But it was a fish that was far too big for the rod, and I was an 8-weight, and I was trying to stop it, and it broke. And I played around with quite a few. I've had a hand in a few of them. Certainly the bass rods are enormously popular down here, and they started out with the smallmouth and the largemouth, and I encouraged them to do the bluegill and then the peacock, and they are very popular rods here. They no longer make them. And a couple of other rods and a few fly lines, Rio as well, a few fly lines. the Saltwater Elite series, particularly the Flats Pro with the 15-foot intermediate tip, had a fair hand in that one. That's a line that is very important in this part of the world for our flats fishing. So a long association with them. Whenever I go to Bainbridge Island, I spend a few hours in the R&D room with the crew there, and they have a list of questions. I talk until my throat runs dry, and answering questions about what's happening down here. And they're all ears. They're wonderful to talk to. They listen to what you have to say, and copious notes are taken, and some of it appears later in product. Some ideas get tossed around. Many of them get rejected because our fishery is not big. A fly line, our fly lines would be just a pimple on the Rio's bum of sales, so they're not going. I hope that 15-foot intermediate tip Elite Flats Pro line is selling well elsewhere, because it is a wonderful line. It's a great line for this part of the world for so much of our tropical fishing, from flats to tidal creeks and so on. So, yeah, they're a wonderful company. I've spent a little bit of time with Mark Bale. They took me to Florida in 2005 to fish for tarpon. I know the reps, Raz Reed over in the east, Big George Cook, wonderful man, fished with him in New Zealand. And the names are, skipping off my head at the moment. But I've seen, I've met a lot of the guys as they've gone through and come and gone. Mark Bale, of course, now has left. He was the real backbone of that company, and in my belief, a wonderful man, and retired. And I have no doubt going to enjoy his retirement immensely. And we got along famously. We had many, many great dinners together, shared many fine bottles of wine.
Wonderful, wonderful. Tell me, we're coming back towards, I'm going to navigate towards fishing again. And at the beginning, one of the questions I was going to ask you was freshwater or salt, which I think I know the answer to. But you talked about the flats fishing, and I remember seeing those first sort of pictures of permit and bonefish in, I think it's New Caledonia, and that must have been exciting to see, to hear about, to learn about. I guess you were probably at the very forefront of when that broke, and I'm sure it was known about locally for a fair time before that. But that must have suddenly opened up fishing there, despite all of the fishing that you have and the varied fishing. That must have opened it up to a whole new audience, not just in Australia, but to the world, to say, actually, there's somewhere else we can go look for these amazing fish.
Yeah, New Caledonia is a fairly special case. I wasn't at the forefront of it. There's a guy called Henry Leroux, who was a Frenchman who came from Paris, and I don't know how he stumbled across this amazing bone fishery at the northern end of Grande Terre, the big island. But Dean Butler, a very famous Australian fisherman and fly fisherman, got onto that fairly early on with Philippe Leroux, not Henri Leroux, Philippe Leroux, excuse me. And Philippe got out. Philippe went troppo, and the little community of guides and so on that he had built up there sort of fell to bits fairly quickly as a lot of the expats from New Caledonia moved in on it, and Philippe being freshly out from France, and these guys had been there for years, and so there's a lot of local politics, and it is not an easy fishery. So I heard about it, and I got onto Google Earth. So it's relatively recent fishery, and looked at the island of Uvea, which is one of the offshore islands, and found some flats out there. And we went out there on an exploratory trip and found bonefish. And then I ended up going to the north of New Caledonia. We also fished a place called the Isle of Pines, which has stonking bonefish. I mean, huge bonefish, but not a lot of them. not fished for. And but the problem there is there's this let's just call it a dislike between the Kanaks and the French. The Kanak people, the Kanak is the term, the name that they call themselves, the indigenous people, very territorial, fairly hostile to Europeans. They really want independence, which would be catastrophic for them, I think. The French do not want to give it up. So there's a bit of conflict in those remote areas. I mean, I had a fella take a swing at me with a machete on one of the outer islands. I mean, he was crazy. He was crazy. One of the local fella, and Anyway, we survived that one. So, but it is if you must be able to speak French to get along, because the Kanaks speak French. They're reluctant to a lot of the time. But English won't really get you through. It's an astonishing place, but a very difficult place. It's very mountainous. The best flats are way up to the north. It's a 300-kilometre drive from the airport. Winding roads. You get in at midnight. Narrow, winding roads. It's white-knuckle stuff. You know, people driving on the wrong side of the road. It's not for the faint-hearted. And then when you get up there, a lot of the time the clouds coming off the mountains, the prevailing wind blows along the mountain range and the clouds plume off the north like smoke coming out of a chimney. And the best fishing is in winter when a low-pressure system moves across to the south and you get clear blue skies and no wind, and it's phenomenal. It is phenomenal. And particularly if you manage to catch the right tides. Phenomenal. The fish are huge. But then there's the problem of negotiating the locals. And the water can be, the guides who worked for Philippe used to guide in wetsuits because the water temperature is 19 degrees Celsius. I remember fishing one day all day on the flats, and by 3 p.m, when the tide had come in too far, I had hypothermia. I was so cold I could barely move.
Wow.
And, I curled up in the sun on the boat. So the flats are cold. It's really challenging stuff. But, man, the fish are big. And there's a lot of them on the right days if you find the right conditions and you get the right place and you find the friendly natives who will take you fishing. Isle of Pines is the place where they're quite used to tourists. So the north is quite remote. It's quite primitive. There's a lot of nickel mining up there, and the miners, are not very well liked by the locals. But the Isle of Pines has a tourist-based economy. They're quite used to visitors. And, you put in a good week there, you may get half a dozen fish, but they're going to be up to 14, 15 pounds. They're big. They're really bloody big.
Yeah, I like that a lot. Now, I get the impression, I'm sure the listeners will as well, that you've travelled to so many places and fished for so many different species. When I was doing my research, I know that you've caught a fair few species, and I wondered if you could tell our listeners how many you're up to now, and also on that list of species, what is number one on that list for you? Which is the one?
So I'm up to 314. So this came about, this counting the species came about as just a friendly competition, but it also came about as this is back in the 80s, as a acknowledgement. I was so sick of being asked, where do you trout fish around here? And, well, I don't. I saltwater, I catch all, and trying to get the idea across to people that fly fishing is not defined by species. It's not defined by trout. It's defined by casting. We cast our fly, we use the line to cast the fly to the target. And a fish lives, therefore it has to eat. Therefore we can make a fly that looks like what it wants to eat, or what it might want to eat, or that might attract it, and use a fly line to present that fly to that fish. So I'm extremely open-minded about it. And that's where the species counting thing came along. So when I'm down at the lake practicing spey casting, someone says, "Oh, where do you trout fish around here?" I go, "Well, I don't. I go carp fishing, or I go fishing for Murray cod, or I go down to Sydney Harbour and I catch yellowtail kingfish or bream, or I go bass fishing in here or there or whatever. I've caught 314 species on fly. This is not about trout fishing. This is about fly fishing." So that's where this whole species counting thing came along. And I do a lot of presentations to fly fishing clubs. And one of my favourites to talk about is my top 10 favourite 10 species. And barramundi are without question number one. Why? I guess they're a very much an indigenous Australian fish. They are found in New Guinea, and they used to be found up through the Indonesian archipelago, but they're very, very prominent along the Australian east coast and through right across the north. Very beautiful fish, eat a fly willingly, don't eat surface flies as often as you'd like them to, require lots of casting. You can sight fish for them, you can catch them in freshwater billabongs, you can catch them in rain. So a billabong is a lagoon, a cut-off lagoon. So in the wet season, these floodplains flood, and then when the dry season comes, the floods shrink, and you're left with lagoons, lily pad-lined lagoons. And the little barramundi grow up in these and grow. They might be trapped in there for a few years before they can get out to the ocean and spawn. So they're a catadromous species, opposite to anadromous. Obviously, they spawn in the salt and grow in the fresh. So you can catch them in little rainforest rivers on the east coast. You can catch them in these huge lagoons. We now know how to breed them, and we can stock them into big impoundments where they grow massive freshwater impoundments where they grow huge. You can catch them not in the ocean, but along ocean beaches. You can sight cast to them on the flats, but mostly we fish for them in the tropical estuaries, those wonderful world of mangroves and stinking mud and life. They're so full of life. And that's where the great barramundi fishing is. And you're casting to structure, you're casting to snags. Your casting needs to be on point. You need to know the sink rate of your fly and your fly line. You've got to work to retrieve. You've got to allow that fly to sink into the zone before you begin your retrieve. And they hit like a brick. It's a hammer blow when they hit the fly, and they want to go straight back into the snag. But they do jump. They're a spectacular jumping fish. They're related to snook. They jump like tarpon. They grow to 50, 60 pounds. They're pretty good eating. And they're just a very, very special fish for the places you find them in. And their willingness to eat a fly. I just love fishing for them. And I haven't been for a couple of years, unfortunately. I did last year. I fished some dams last year up in Queensland. We saw them, but it was winter, and in winter they get up in the wheat beds and they lie in the warm wheat beds and they bask in there, and you can sight cast to them. But whether or not they'll eat a fly is a different matter. So I missed that trip this year. I had a couple of weeks of that fishing planned, and I'm pretty pissed off that I didn't make it. Anyway, so that's barramundi.
They sound super cool. Something that jumps like a tarpon. I love snook as well because they're the sort of unsung hero of saltwater fishing. Yeah, that sounds great to me. So they sound a fabulous fish. Is there one that you would really love to tick off the list that you're thinking, yeah, that's a species?
Atlantic salmon. I was in Scotland in 2019. My mum grew up in Kingussie on the banks of the Spey River. And I went to Scotland, and it was my son's wedding, and I didn't fish out of respect to my dear partner. And but I would dearly love to fish for Atlantic salmon somewhere, sometime before they all disappear. Let's hope that it never comes to that. Maybe Russia, somewhere.
Nice, and that'll get all that double-handed practice to good use as well, won't it?
Absolutely, mate. I spent 2 weeks up in BC with Simon Gorsworth, taking photos and fishing, and I got one bump. I got a bump on the Bulkley. Simon only got one fish in 10 days. It was a pretty tough year. I think there's probably potentially some wonderful swing fishing in New Zealand for the king salmon, but the window's pretty brief. I have a good mate over there who caught 5 in a day, which is unheard of, swinging. He's a real keen two-handed dude. But there are some massive rivers over there, massive with huge trout in them that no one fishes for. Everyone fishes the small to medium-sized rivers, and they fish up the edges. And I love those. I love those big rivers with the two-hander, like a 4 or a 5 weight, and swinging them with fast-sinking lines. They're big and deep and swift. And I stayed at a lodge at the north end of the South Island. I go to New Zealand a lot, and I stayed at a lodge up there, and a wonderful lodge, Owen River Lodge. And the guides told me that 80% of the fish are found in 20% of the water, so they're along the edge at the margins of the bank. But I actually want to fish for the 20% of the fish that are in 80% of the water. They're the real big ones. They're the ones that don't come up onto the edge. So the ones on the edge are often not so well conditioned. Sometimes they're very well conditioned, but I want to get the ones that are hanging and feeding in the heavy water, that can deal with that. And I've hooked a couple of them. They have been absolutely unstoppable. They didn't jump, so I don't know if they were big browns. I suspect big rainbows. And this one particular river that we call the Big W, just headed across the river into the logs on the other side without ever showing itself at a blistering pace. And that's what really fires me up on the two-hander, those fish. The ones on the edge, you catch them all, the dry fly, nymph, prawn, sight fish, yeah, great. I don't want to sight fish, I just want to swing.
Nice. It's good to be different. And I remember being down there and seeing the salmon, I think it was on the Rangitata. And at the time, that was 10, 12 years ago, I was thinking, wow, how would you get to those fish? But now, obviously, with Mo tips, tungsten tips, whatever, because I was trying to figure how I'd swing a fly, and the water flow was so strong there. I didn't know how I'd be able to get it down, but those changes that we've seen now have allowed us to do that. That sounds right up my street. I'm with you, man, on that. That just sounds a fabulous, really, really interesting trip. And I like the sound of that. But tell me, how does fly fishing look and feel to you right now?
Prosperous. Very busy down here. Lots of good stuff happening. Lots of communication on it. Lots of talk. Lots of people fishing. It's thriving. Thriving. We've actually got some specialist fly shops now. There's a couple that have been around for a long time, but there's another one opened up recently. Lots of tackle available. I mean, I can use that old line. I remember back when I first started, you couldn't get this and you could, but these days it's all on tap. We can get most of the good stuff. Yeah, it's doing very, very well.
Great, and you're enjoying it as much as ever. It sounds like it.
Absolutely. Yeah. I pick and choose what I do, Pete. I've got much more into hunting these days too. I started really enjoying walking the hills with a rifle and shooting like small game, mostly for the table. Monique, my partner, is French, and we love our food and we love eating wild game. But I'm really looking forward to getting out of this lockdown. I've got lots planned. Our native bass, which is a freshwater fish. I have some wonderful carp fishing close to home. I know in the UK it's growing. I'm really enjoying seeing people in the UK start to put up pics of carp caught on fly and mullet. I mean, those guys chasing those sea mullet and sea bass and pike and all of that stuff's fairly recent. Carp down here are an enormously popular. They're a pest. They're a scourge in our waterways. And in several states, you have to actually kill them. these are all wild things, and they're in our waterways. They make up, I heard recently, 90% of the biomass of our inland waterways are carp. And some of the fishing we have for them is absolutely outstanding in the clearer lakes, like some of that Spanish stuff. And so I spent a fair bit of time out there fishing for that, simply because they're so available, and it's sight fishing, and I do it with a 5-weight. And in summer, I get to fish for them with dry flies. I target them with grasshoppers, and that is super fishing. And that's through the middle of the day when the sun's high in the sky. And then early in the morning, I'll fish for the Murray cod and the yellow belly and our native fish, which is also wonderful fishing. And that's all within an hour or two of where I live.
It sounds to me like you've got it sorted really, really well. If people want to find you, I was just looking, we've talked well over an hour now, and if people want to find you, Peter, or do you have social media handles? Do you have a website? If people want to look at and learn from your vast experience of fishing, how can people find you?
I'm extremely available on Facebook under my own name, Peter Morse. I'm on Instagram a little bit. I don't. Instagram's a phone thing for me. I'm of that generation where I don't live on my phone. I've got an old-fashioned iPhone 6, so the keypad's, tiny little bloody thing. But I'm on Facebook a lot. I run the Australian fly fishing page, and I'm there under my own name. And I get back to anyone who wants to contact me. I'm proud of being a good communicator. I have no prejudice there. If you want to contact me, if you want to travel to Australia and you want some advice, remember it's an awfully big place. We have some wonderful trout fishing here for those interested in that. I do love my trout fishing. Don't get me wrong. You said before, freshwater, saltwater. It's the salinity of the water doesn't matter to me. I fly fish whatever water's in front of me for whatever species, and I get down to Tassie a couple of times a year. Tasmania has some super fishing, super lock style fishing and sight fishing and tailing fish, and in the salt water, just remember, it's a massive continent. I've got people who see photos of me with a big GT and say, "Oh, I want to come and do that with you," but it took me 3 days to get there, and it's a big place.
Peter, thank you so much for taking the time. As a fan of your TV program for a long time, as a fan of your photography and your outlook as well, I've seen it over the years and I absolutely love it. And for having you appear in Fly Culture as well was a thrill for me personally as well. It's been lovely to be able to chat with you and have you on the Fly Culture podcast. Thank you for taking the time to talk with me today. It's been absolutely brilliant.
Been super, Pete. Thank you so much. And hello to everyone, to all you fly fishermen out there who listen to the podcast and read the magazine. And yep, I'm here if you want some information on travelling to Australia. Give me a hoy. Cheers, mate.
Wonderful. Thanks, everyone. This has been the Fly Culture podcast. I hope you've enjoyed this one. As ever, there'll be plenty more. If you've enjoyed this one, if you haven't already, I hope you will consider subscribing at some stage as well. But these are always great fun to do. And this one in particular, along with, I enjoy every single one of them, but getting the chance to speak with people I look up to and so greatly is fantastic. And I hope you've enjoyed this one too. So thanks so much for listening to the Fly Culture podcast.
The Fly Culture podcast is brought to you in association with Fly Culture, a quarterly print magazine. For more information, please visit flyculturemag.com. You can also find Fly Culture on Instagram, Facebook and Twitter.